So we'll have folks, I'm sure, popping in as we keep going here, but we'll go ahead and kick it off so we can get as much content in as we can and/or questions and collaboration at the end of all this to see what folks want to talk about. Hopefully everyone here is in the session wanting to learn about PowerShell and how to use the PowerShell for your own identity management system. I'm Chris Thomas. I am the desktop engineer for Ingham Intermediate School District. We service about 7 contracts right now with the schools, and the identity management system that we drew up for ourselves is working in all 7 of those schools to create at least student accounts, and we're still working towards staff in multiple districts. You can reach me at cthomas@inghamist.org if you have any questions or you want to collaborate on something. And you can also reach me on Twitter at @automatemystuff. I'll let Eric go ahead and introduce himself.
You actually put my Twitter on there. Don't pay attention to that.
This is a peer pressure, man. You got to get on it.
So I am Eric Crable. I am the technology director at Tri-County Area Schools. I created my first identity management system using, actually, we won't talk about the first one. Well, the first one that I made using PowerShell many years ago at the Montcalm ISD when I was the network administrator there. That one is currently being used in, I would say 4 or 5 different school districts, plus now I've built a new one for Tri-County. So I've been doing this for quite some time. Chris and I have both presented multiple times at different MAIDS conferences about this topic, and we decided this time to really break it down into more of a 101 type session and take you through the process and really hopefully send you away with a working something that you can do. So my email is ecrable@tricountyschools.com. My Twitter that I almost never ever use, so don't contact me there, is Eric_Maids. I'm going to be mainly just monitoring the chat here and answering stuff, playing around with the Discord thing. I do want to figure out who that was that made those bots that you were talking about earlier, because
that was Adrian Towner had mentioned that he has some bot experience. So
I'm trying to put together a Michigan EdTech Discord server for anybody interested. Get a kind of a live version of the Techsy listserv. So starting to play with that a little bit. So anybody who would like to, I'll post the link in the chat and we can play with that a little bit. And yeah, so that's what I'm going to do. And Chris is going to call on me for, I don't know, backup when he needs it. Otherwise,
stuff here and there.
There you go.
Yeah, if you hear quiet space, go ahead and speak up. So I did see, I do need to speak up a little bit. I was trying to maintain an even tone here and not get too excited and get too jittery. So I'll try and talk up a little bit, but I've also turned on the assistance as far as voice to text. So hopefully some of that will actually be readable if I enunciate my words properly. If anyone needs to gain access to the presentation, I have emailed it to Nick, so it will be on the MAIDS download repository, but you can also hit up GitHub. And my repository that I put stuff in is chris@automatemystuff, and I've got a folder with all my past presentations in there if you want to gain access to this one or previous ones. And as Eric said, we've presented on this multiple times, mostly in like roundtable sessions. So we would come together as a roundtable and talk about our identity management and show off some scripts and kind of try and get others to show theirs off, but it was never really everything. And I'd previously given some presentations on like a PowerShell intro and a PowerShell intermediate over a couple of years, and there was some good feedback from that. So what I tried to do with this presentation is combine like the concept of all 3 of those into this one presentation and give you the building blocks to hopefully make you feel confident building this thing yourself. But before we go getting into technical, one thing I like to do anytime someone gives me a soapbox to stand on is to talk about a few things that are important to me, and in the soft skills realm. So there's a guy named Don Jones, Godfather PowerShell. He wrote a book called Be the Master. Now this book, it really resonated with me. He talks about and harkens back to the days of apprentices and masters and stuff, right? And You would apprentice under a master with the hope that one day you can either take over his trade or you can go open your own trade in another village or a town. And like the idea and that concept is still alive here. We just don't treat it that way. Or if it's not live, we need to be encouraging it, right? So anything you've learned, whether you taught yourself or you learned it from someone else in the industry, that was something they did for you. So now at this point, it's an obligation for you to pour back into your community, pour back into those that are around you, whether that's a peer, a supervisor, or one of your juniors. If you've benefited from this industry, it's your responsibility to help others benefit from this industry as well. So this book really resonated with me. Um, if there's interest in this group to go down this route, I've contacted Don. I would need to get some clarity on the specifics, but he's offered me an ebook license for maids for a pretty decent price, which I believe would allow me to give the PDF version out to everyone because the book has been retired. He's the publisher, he still owns the rights, but if there's interest, I'll continue that conversation with John, or Don. But it was a really good concept, and it's really the only reason I'm here presenting because I want to pour back into the community that's given to me. And another thing that I like to talk about with people, I'm not terribly struggling with it right now, but it's something I have struggled with over the years, and I've gotten positive feedback by putting these in my presentations. But if you've never looked into the idea of imposter syndrome, it's important for me to help others understand what imposter syndrome is. It's that feeling that someone's going to figure out I don't know what the hell I'm doing at some point and figure out I'm a fraud because I'm just figuring this stuff out as I go and I'm researching things as I go and I'm just a lifelong learner trying to add to my skill set. But until I could recognize that there was a name to that, it always just bothered me and it really weighed me down. So I like to try and walk some people through like my journey and how I experienced that. So Steve Schwartz wrote an article, and when you're working with my PowerPoint slideshow, whether you're accessing it from the GitHub or pulling it from Made site later, any of the imagery or text that is green is clickable and will take you back to an article for more reference. So we're not going to go into everything because there's tons of reading you could do over the right. This is the stuff that I've accumulated over the years of seeing. But Steve wrote an article called "The Three Types of Knowledge," or "No One Knows What the F They're Doing." And basically, I broke down his article into these three images that he had. And you start out life with this green section of stuff you know. And then there's a blue section of stuff you know you don't know, but you could research it to become stronger and more knowledgeable on it. And you're less dangerous with blue stuff. But in that red section, that is things that you don't know, you don't even know about. So you're dangerous if you start touching those things or working with it. And so school tries to get you to this point where they believe they're going to grow your green section really large and reduce your blue. But in all reality, you leave school or you leave your work experience, and yes, your green is larger. You know more stuff, but you also know you don't know a lot of stuff because you only briefly touched on it in school or you've only briefly touched on it at work. But in those blue sections are things that you know that you need to research more, right? So my hope whenever I give a presentation to folks is that not only will my content have enough that you could follow up on afterwards, but that at least if I've mentioned something, when it comes up in a year, 2 years down the line, you can think, oh, I remember Chris talking about that. I'm going to go research it so that you're less dangerous with that. And then Don Jones himself, right? This is a guy who is up in tech ed and all the Microsoft conferences talking and speaking alongside Jeffrey Snover, the guy who created PowerShell, and he's talking about feeling like an imposter and feeling like the people around him know more than he knows. He's only teaching basic level PowerShell, whereas the people he's taught have gone on to do really crazy things with the things he's taught them. But that's a good thing, right? And the one thing that stuck with me that he said was about losing the syndrome is own what you know, be confident, not arrogant, ask questions, be wrong, because it's okay to be wrong, but don't be silent and don't think you don't belong. So Eric had mentioned that the quiet group a little bit earlier, before some folks have joined. So I know people at times tend to, shy away from either turning the cameras on or unmuting their mic if they want to ask a question. But throughout this session, if you want to ask a question, you belong. If you're in K-12 IT, this is the group for you. These are your people. Make yourself known. Donna, anyone who's ever looked at the Insider program for the longest time, Donna Sarker was the lead of the Windows Insider program. And she's another highly successful woman talking about imposter syndrome and talking about how imposter syndrome isn't just a woman thing, because that's where the initial research began, was researching imposter syndrome within women. But then it branched out, and there's lots of people talking about it at this point. But she had a really good TED talk on it that's was nice to listen to. Scott Hanselman, Guy's like a Microsoft fellow now at this point or something. But he had a good article and was looking at speaking at South by Southwest on imposter syndrome alongside Jessica Hagee. But one of the things that I saw from one of his friends, they said, I think the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And God, is that frustrating because as you find more things you don't know, or as Andy, if you guys were in the cybersecurity, the incident response thing, right? It's like it's scary to go down that route of all the planning and who do you need to contact and what do you do if this is down. But we need to make those motions. It has to happen. So you just got to get over yourself, realize that there are those things you're not going to be able to do, and lean on what Andy was talking about and make incremental changes. If you do something, at least you've done something. But if you do nothing, you've continued to do nothing and perpetuate your issues. Jessica had a good talk about focusing on learning, right? So the more we pour into the documentation or just learning what the issue is the user's dealing with or whatnot and reading logs, we become stronger from that learning. Making good enough goals, stop being a perfectionist for yourself. I hear this enough from my boss. It's got to be good enough. Let's just do it and move on. That's something that's hard to do at times. And taking off the mask. None of us are going to get over the issues we're dealing with if we don't talk about it openly. So my mask is off, has been for several years. I'm pretty much an open book and I'm comfortable with that at this point. And then what Chanel was talking about is she had this struggle, right? And she broke it down in her thought process. She says, I need to do more. But then she talks about, no, I don't need to do more. I want to do more. But then at the same time, sometimes I got to forget about number one and number two just so I can take a breath and relax a little bit and get back in my mental headspace. And that life can happen in a moment. So making those incremental changes and building momentum on it and continuing to work through processes and issues is going to get you to a better place. And the last one, especially as I give this talk, there is danger in comparison. If I sit here and compare myself to Nick Hay and the amount of cloud he's using right now, I'm going to get jealous of him, right? Or if I think of some of the automation that Eric might have in place that I don't have in place, or his his cool thing he's doing with the central variables, I'm jealous of that, but I just haven't had the time to dig in, or I haven't made the time to dig in. But I don't have to compare myself to those folks, right? If I look at where we were and where we are, we've made progress. That's positive. I don't need to make progress according to what these other people are doing. So as Eric and I talk about our own solutions, don't compare yourself to us. Take the concepts we're teaching you and figure out how that works for your school district. Okay, so now we're gonna get into some more technical things. Here's how it began, right? So how it started at Ingham was I had shortly been on staff here. I'd come from Bloomfield Hills, and I was just kind of like just a technician at the point. But when I came here, I was seen from like a leadership role in a way, and I started trying to take that seriously. And one of the things I saw was frustration on our help desk team. And what the process looked like is a secretary or the registrar would put a student in the SIS. Then the secretary would go put that same information that they just filled in the SIS, they'd go put it in a Google form. And there was chances for mistyping in that process. That Google form would fire off an email to help desk, which would create a ticket. Then help desk would create the user accounts in AD and Office 365 in Google as appropriate to the school we're working with. Then help desk would add the student to groups or distribution lists as appropriate for the student, say their year of grad distribution group, or maybe some security groups that allow them to the share that for their program they're working with. Help desk would then manually license the user. So we had Office 365 licensing, and they'd go in the portal and manually license the user. And then we also use our SIS as a reporting reference site. So we put in the student's username, email address, and for the students we know the password of, we fill the password in PowerSchool as well in a secure field. And then the teachers, I know people look up, but teachers have the ability to pull a report and get a report of all their students' usernames and passwords, or look up an individual student should they have an issue. So help desk would go fill that information back in the SIS. Then they would close their ticket, note the ticket up, and reach out to the staff member who had made the request or the secretary who had made the request to let them know it was done. And a normal business, this wasn't a big deal, right? They could handle it. Create a user account or two. There's a process. They follow the process. It worked out pretty well. But when you talk about this getting towards the start of school and these secretaries are coming back from their vacation time and inputting a couple hundred students across different buildings, help desk became a little overwhelmed with the process. So what I offered to do is I could create a script. I shouldn't have opened my mouth because that little script turned into a whole project involving multiple departments and all kinds of systems. But I think we're at a better place than we were before. So what I offered to build was a script. And what you can do is come back to this slide later and just look at what the script is doing after we've gone over what all these PowerShell things mean. Because if we look at this script, yes, it's 61 lines, but it doesn't need to be 61 lines. If we look at this thing, I got a comment block up here where I was talking about like what my intentions were. It's unnecessary. We're importing a module. We'll talk about that. Um, we do a for each loop, so we loop through a bunch of different users. We're going to talk more about that. We define variables for the user, things that we want to use. We're going to talk more about that in a little bit. And then we go and we create the user, add in some groups, and set their passwords. Now, I was planning on eventually getting some Office 365 and Google stuff in this script, but that was before we moved to products that could handle this stuff for us. So this right here, I mean, when I got the script got the script created, I was able to just daily or so, or multiple times a day, I would, work with the apps team or myself, and I would pull an export of all the students, and then I would run it through this, and it would attempt to create the students. Now, mind you, at this time I had no error handling. So if the AD account already existed, I'd get an error saying can't create new AD user. And frankly, I just didn't care because it took the load off help desk, and it made the process just work and made it faster because I could create hundreds of counts in the time it would take them to create 5. So this is somewhere you can get yourself. You can get this by the end of this talk. But what I'm going to show you is a broader scope of what you can do through this. But so before we can get into really feeling comfortable reading that script that I just showed you on the last screen, we've got to go over some basics. But before we go over the basics, what do we got going on in chat here? Looks like a couple people. Some Discord. What did Robin say? Great section. Let's definitely deal with that. Okay, good. Bill, comment sections and scripts and code provide far more value than people giving credit. Yeah, so Bill's saying that comments in the code can provide value. So you'll find, as I share screenshots throughout the presentation, you'll find that I have some sections that have either comment blocks or comment lines. And not only is it for me, but it's for future admins. What happens when I no longer work for AMISD and someone else has to be responsible for the scripts that I wrote? Um, that's where the onus is on me as the developer or the writer of that script to put enough comments in there, hopefully that folks will be able to understand what I was trying to accomplish and what the process is. So for PowerShell basics, we're going to go over some vocabulary. These are going to be just some high bullet points. The next slides are going to have more details. So when we talk about vocabulary, there's going to be a shell. The shell is basically your blue command prompt. This is the place where you can run commandlets, you can run some scripts, but you're not coding your scripts in the shell. You're just running things. When you want to code your scripts, that's where you'd be using, say, the PowerShell ISC or the integrated scripting environment. People might be giving me stink eye right now saying you should be using VS Code. Yes, we should be using VS Code. PowerShell ISC is no longer getting development. I have ISC steroids, so I still use that quite a bit as an add-on to it. So I don't really need VS Code, but maybe one day I'll make the transition. And if one of you are sitting here thinking, man, this guy should be using VS Code, I challenge you to put in a presentation proposal for the fall event and show us all how to use VS Code. I would love to sit through a session of someone that's one of our peers showing me how to use VS Code and how they use it in their life. I just don't have the time for it right now when I'm comfortable in the ISC. But the ISC is nice because it gives you contextual highlighting. It gives you selective execution of code. This is stuff you can't do in the shell. It's really powerful to be able to do that in a different program. It's important to understand what a commandlet is, or if you read that little cmdlet commandlet, that is what the PowerShell commands are. So they're always in a verb-noun form. So get-AD user or new-AD user. That is the function of how the commandlets will be put together. There's the idea of a variable. So if you've never done scripting before, a variable is just a thing you assign a value to, and it can be whatever you want. You could say $users equal something, and that will, anytime you call users, you'll be referencing whatever that was equal to. You could be as verbose as you want and say something like $I wish you had a strong password for those users who have passwords under the 8-digit minimum, and we have got to apply fine-grained password policies to them. Or you could be some obtuse developer who just uses $X. I hate the people who use $X. There's no context to it. It's not helpful. Don't be that person when you're writing scripts for your peers. When you're talking about parameters, so when we have commandlets, we have parameters. Those are the dash values. So if I say new dash AD user, and some of this will make more sense as I'm talking this out later if you don't have much experience with PowerShell, but if I'm talking about, say, new dash AD user, I could supply a parameter of dash name with a value of Chris Thomas. That's kind of the idea of how a parameter will work. But when you're working with parameters, there's different types. So we might be working with a named parameter. And so if we're looking at a named parameter, one of the things we'll notice is if I was doing get child item, I have dash path and a value and dash filter and a value. Those are two named parameters of path and filter. Now there's also positional parameters. If we look at this one, I'm supplying the same values that I was supplying to path and filter, but I'm not actually calling out path and filter. It's assumed by the commandlet that the first position value, if not defined, will be the path, and the second position value, if not defined, will be the filter. Now, figuring this out is something you would do with get help on the commandlet. We'll talk about that in a little bit, how you can discover these sorts of things, but it's important to understand that you can see people doing it in their scripts or see examples online or even write it into your own scripts where you don't fill out the position. But what I'm going to say here is if you're writing a script that's going to be put in production or shared with someone online or a peer, please always use named parameters. Don't make someone have to figure out what, you know, star.exe was intending to be put on. If I put dash filter, now I know what that value was, what parameter that value is for. The last parameter type you'll find is a switch parameter type. So just like earlier where we did a path and a filter named parameter, we're also going to throw on a dash recurse, and that's just on or off. So I either supply recurse or I don't supply recurse. I don't have to provide a value afterwards, and that's where the switch comes in. This is a concept that can be kind of tough for people to understand is the idea of an object. If you've never done object-oriented programming, or if you're coming from, say, the Linux world where all of your scripting was text-based and text parsing, when you get into PowerShell, you can still do text parsing and all that sort of stuff, but the real power comes when you can wrap your head around working with objects. Not only working with objects that you'll get from the commandlets you're working with, but potentially creating your own custom objects in your scripts depending on your needs. And so, for example, a custom object I might do is if I'm going to be pulling information from disparate systems about a user, I could pull all that together and put it in a custom object about that user and then export it from a report. It becomes powerful when you can work with objects. But the idea of an object here, the concept that stuck with me from the past was thinking of an object like, let's say I'm a bike salesman and I've got a whole store of bicycles. Now, those bicycles have properties to them. They could have the color, the wheel size, the frame type, those sorts of things. Those are properties about the bicycles that I can filter out the inventory in my store based on the property someone's looking for. But there's also methods that I can do to these bicycles. There's things I can do to or against the bicycle. So I could pedal the bicycle. That's a method. I could steer the bicycle. That's a method. So whenever you're working with an object, you either have methods to do against or on the object, or you have properties of things you know about the object. And that's kind of like the high level overview of working with objects. Another vocabulary term is the module. So there are going to be times where you might see some idea of a script online, or what we're going to talk about today with, like, say, new AD user and get AD user. If you don't have the module that contains those commandlets, you're not going to be able to run the scripts. So it's important to understand what module these commandlets came from so that you can ensure the machine you're running it on has it. So say you develop this whole great script on your machine because you have remote server automation tools, administration tools on your machine, right? You got RSATs, you got Active Directory users and computers, which gets you your module for Active Directory. And so now you can do things like new AD user and get AD user. But if you take that script and go try and run it on your automation box and you don't have those same modules on your automation box, then it's not going to run. So it's important to understand where these things come from. When you work with modules, you might find script modules that are PSM1 files. You might be working with scripts that come from DLL files. This is where you'll find most of your modules for, say, Config Manager and working with PowerShell. Or you might find that you have dynamic modules. So if I were to enter into a PS session or start a PowerShell session on a remote server, I'm not actually on that box. I've got a remote session to the box and executing code on that remote box. Meanwhile, I could have modules that only exist during that session between me and this box. My session here doesn't have those modules active to me. because they exist out there in that remote box I'm PS sessioning into. So it's kind of important to understand that as you grow in your PowerShell skills. We'll also talk about the pipeline at times. So the pipeline is that command, the up one, it's by the backslash above the enter key. Now, when you use a pipeline, you're essentially taking the output of one set of stuff, passing the output of that to the input of the next commandlet. So if I were to do, say, get AD user where last logon time is within the last 180 days, I could pipe that to disable user. So I took a commandlet that I was filtering down, and I took all the output from that and piped it into the input of the disable AD user. So that's where pipeline comes in. This is a concept that some folks struggle with at times when they see it in scripts, is the $_. Um, that is just basically referring to the object that's currently in the pipeline, or the object that's currently in the loop that you're currently in within your PowerShell script. It's also referred to as this in some documentation, but the more appropriate way you won't see all too often outside of Microsoft documentation is $PS item. So whenever you see something like $_ dot SAM account name or $PS item dot SAM account name, you're taking that object that's currently in the pipeline, and when you put a dot there and reference a sub property, you're just calling the property of that user, right? So if I'm in a loop or if I'm in a pipeline and I do $_ dot SAM account name, it's going to spit out every single SAM account name for the objects as it flows through. Functions, you can create your own custom functions if you wanted to. So let's say you wanted to run, every time you do this thing, you're going to be running 3 different commandlets. Make a function, or consider making a function for those 3 commandlets to do that thing for you. This is a bit of a higher level concept, but definitely something you could start to play around with. One of the first functions I made within my PowerShell profile was get-ASCII shrug. This was before Windows gave us the Windows key period, and we got access to the Kimoji things with the table flip and the different ASCII art. Every once in a while, I like throwing ASCII art in a chat I'm having or whatnot. So I made a custom function in PowerShell that I could just go get-ASCII shrug, and it would spit out the ASCII characters and pipe that to clip. And so it was in my clipboard, and I could just go paste it in whatever chat program I was using. But there's all kinds of things you can do with functions. Aliases are important to understand. If you're coming from the Linux world, it's important to understand that you have access to ls if you want to do a directory listing. But if you're used to command prompt, you can do dir or dir for directory listing. Meanwhile, ls and dir are just aliases of get-child item. So it's important to understand that aliases exist so that you can use them, but please do not put aliases inside your scripts. Always use the full commandlet, the official commandlet within your scripts. Just be lazy with aliases for yourself. Arrays are another important thing to understand. Arrays are a data structure of just stuff. It could be a collection of items, or it could be a collection of properties and values. And you'll use arrays in different ways throughout your scripts. But you could also reference those arrays by index value, understanding that index values always start at 0 and then work their way down. So your first object in the array will always be object 0 in the index. So you'll see some places in here where I do use some arrays. Commenting is important, much as Bill called out in chat. Commenting your scripts is helpful. Just having a couple lines of, maybe someone can come over later and interpret it. But if you have a couple comments in your script, you can give more context or more narrative to what you were trying to do in that step. But it's important to understand that you don't have to put a hash symbol on every single line to comment it. You can make a comment block by doing an alligator open comment block and a comment block alligator closing, angle bracket, whatever you want to call it. And escape character is an important one because I'm going to cover some concepts here with using the escape or the grave accent character, the one up by tilde next to 1. I'm going to encourage you to try not using this too often. It can cause some confusion, especially with folks who are newer. But there are times where you'll need escape characters to either draw new lines for your commandlets that I'll show off, or you might want to display the literal value of something. So let's say I got a script and I want to write something to the screen. I might want to write, $variable, $user, but I want it to say literally $user. I don't want it to interpret that and give me the user who's currently in that variable. So to do that, that's where I would put an escape character right before $user, and then it's going to spell out literal value of $user. Many of these concepts, if you search escape character PowerShell, you're going to find additional resources for folks trying to teach you these concepts. And it's also important to understand the command history. Pressing the up and down arrow within PowerShell will get you your last commands and you can edit them. Or if you were to do get dash history, you could look at your history. But I've seen some folks I've worked with who, they'll type a commandlet out and it won't be quite what they wanted, and then they'll type it all out again. Meanwhile, they could have just hit enter and backspace a couple keys and fix something. So just important to understand that up and down key history. All right, so here's some more stuff. This is going to be the new style of how the slides are going to look going forward. The slides going forward are going to typically have some sort of content in the middle, whether it's a GIF or an image of my scripts, along with official Microsoft documentation link at the bottom, because some of these concepts we could talk 15 minutes on just the concepts themselves. And then at the top, I'm going to have essentially the concept I want you to wrap your head around, but also some uh, examples of what you could type in your own shell to get comfortable with it. So for this example, I'm trying to explain to you tab expansion, because I'll see folks type out get dash 80 user or new dash 80 user. You don't have to type everything, right? Especially if you're poor at typing. If you type as much as possible as you can hit the tab key and it will finish the expression for you. So that can be used here where I'm finishing new 80 user. Or if I put a dash and start tabbing through, I'll start to see all the different property value sets that I can put in here. Or if I want to get really fancy, you'll see in the GIF in a minute, if I hit Control Space after I hit the dash, I'm going to get a menu I can go through with my arrow keys and hit Enter and fill that in. So this just kind of helps people understand like what properties or what parameters they want to fill in for their commandlets. And also the tab expansion just makes your life easier. And tab expansion also works with path values. So if you are supplying a path to your CSV you're importing, you can type C:\\, tab, 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 and go through that way as well. Another cool concept is regions. So when you write your scripts, yes, it will add additional lines to your script. But the idea of a region is it gives you, at least within the integrated scripting environment or something like VS Code, gives you collapsible regions to make your code more readable. So let's say, for example, I had a region called variable declarations. Once I've declared all my variables, I can just collapse that whole region so I don't have to see that code. Get the code out of my face. I don't need to see it. It's still usable because no matter if you have your code expanded or contracted, it's still going to function. So what my GIF is showing you here is me minimizing and maximizing those comment blocks or the regions, sorry, and then still showing that the code runs just fine. So regions are really nice to break your code up. Command syntax. This is one that took me a while to wrap my head around. The important part with command syntax is the square brackets. So if you look up here for the example I'm giving you is we have a command name, and there might be a dash and no square brackets with a value. So I don't have an example of that right here, but what we do have is this fourth item where we have a bracket around an optional parameter name, but no square bracket around the value. So when we look at, say, new AD user here in the syntax, new AD user is telling us that the name parameter is optional, but the string value of the name is required because there's no square bracket around it. So what this tells me, now that we've talked about positional parameters, is the name is a positional parameter. I don't have to supply it. I could just do new AD user Chris Thomas, and I'm going to get a new user called Chris Thomas. But I don't have a bunch of other properties and values filled out for that user. Everything else is optional. Whereas if I look at a command like, say, add AD group member, we'll see that the identity is optional, the value of it is not. The member property is optional, but the value is not. And then meanwhile, as we look at the rest of these, the auth type, there's a square bracket around not only the parameter, but the value set as well. So when you've got square brackets around your parameter and your value set, the whole thing is optional. You don't need to use it. When the square bracket is around just the parameter, that means you don't have to supply the parameter because it's positional. But if you have no square brackets at all, everything's required. Not only the named parameter, but also the value that you put in there. So hopefully that helps some folks when you do get help on some of these commandlets or get command on some of these commandlets that you have the ability to feel confident reading the syntax here. Splatting is one that I know Eric really found fun to goof around with. So the whole idea with splatting here is this is a traditional sense. This is a script that I would have written before. And on my new AD user line, and let's take a minute here to look at this. I'm importing some users and looping through, and I'm declaring some variables, and then I'm creating the user and adding them to some groups. This is going back to that base level script that any of you could use in your school district to just get your users created. Take that monkey off your back. Now, when you look at line 25 for the new AD user, depending on the resolution of your screen, you might be horizontal scrolling to see all of the parameters and values that we're using to create this user. So what some folks would do in the past is they would use that escape character or that backtick. And so what you end up having is that line 25 calls new AD user, and then we do a backtick, and we supply the parameter and the value, backtick, parameter, value, backtick, all the way into the last line where you have to remember, don't put the backtick. And there's some more caveats here, right? If you put a space after the backtick, it's broken. If you forget the backtick, it's broken. If someone comes in to support your script afterwards and didn't know about backticks, they're probably going to break it. So what I'm offering to you is try splatting. Yes, this makes your script more readable, but it can also have room for failure. So with splatting, if you compare left to right, functionally it's the same. We have basically the same amount of lines to the script. But what we did differently here is we defined a variable on line 24 called new AD user, new user splat, and we open up an array. We have an @ symbol, curly bracket, and anything contained within this array, we are defining parameter names and the values that will go along with those parameter names. It's important to understand when you're working with a splatting system that your parameter names must match exactly what the commandlet wanted. So when you look over here and I was using dash name, it has to be name. Dash display name has to be display name. So it's very important because what's going to happen is when you come down to line 40 here and you do new AD user and you just supply it @ new user splat, it's going to go look at that array that we put together, and it's going to go through the array and say, okay, here are my parameter sets. Which ones can I fill in with the values? And if you don't have the names matching, let's say you put, instead of display name, you put full name, it ain't going to work. You have to have it matching. But splatting is really cool. It cleans up your stuff. Get help is another one to understand because you could teach yourself everything you need to know about PowerShell, not only the syntax, the parameters that you need and what they'll accept for input, along with examples of how to write your commandlets, all from Get Help. Now, what I'm trying to show in this slide is, let's say we do get help on new AD user. It's going to give us a very limited help section. It's going to give us some syntax, a general description, and some information about how to use it. What we could do, though, to make it more useful for us is throw a dash examples on the end, and then it's going to give us some examples of like a scenario in the commandlet and the syntax that would meet that scenario. And most commandlets at this point have 3, 4 examples in them, so it really you should find an example that meets your use case. But at times it's going to be a little difficult to read those examples and really understand how they work or understand, does this parameter accept pipeline input? Because we talked about taking the output of one commandlet and piping it to the input of another commandlet. But you're going to find that some commandlets will not accept pipeline input. And the only way to find that out is to get full help on the commandlet to look at those parameters to see if they accept pipeline input. Now, one more thing you could do for yourself is that you could throw on a dash show window, which you'll notice in the GIF as it continues to play, just opens up a little Microsoft like help window, and you can scroll through it on the side. And then to go along with that, you could also do dash online, which would open up in your native browser so that you can scan it on another window or keep your documentation upside somewhere else. Really important for you to understand how to get help yourself. Get command, I don't have any content to show you here. I talked about earlier how it's important to understand where your commandlets come from, because let's say this all works perfectly on your laptop when you were writing the script, and then you go put it on, say, your DC or some automation server that you created, and you find that your automation server doesn't have the modules you need to run it. How do you determine where that module came from, right? So that's where we'd do something like get command for new AD user. And when I do get command on new AD user, it tells me what module it came from. So then I can ensure this remote box has the module. Or let's go a different route. Let's say I install some new module and I want to understand what what commands exist in the module, I could do git command against the module. There's a bunch of things you can do. You could also filter on the verb, you can filter on the noun, you can filter on both verb and noun. And there's some examples up there of things you can run in your own shell to get kind of comfortable with understanding git command. The next one we have is get member. So we talked about objects, and we talked about how objects have methods you can act upon the object with and properties that you know about the object. But how do you know what methods and properties are on an object is the question you'll get. So that's where getMember comes in. We could take a commandlet, or we could take a value in a variable that we've defined, and you can take that thing and pipe that thing to get-member. And there's an alias for that, pipe to GM if you're being lazy. But we could take something like pipe that to getMember. So if we look at get AD user, for example, what you'll notice here is if I do get AD user on C Thomas, it provides me 17 values within member, 17 methods and properties on my AD object. But I know that there's a whole lot more properties on an AD user, so that's confusing to me, right? So until I do get AD user C Thomas property star, and then pipe that to get member, now I can see I got what 200 plus properties and methods that I know about this object. So there are going to be times where you come across commandlets that when you run it by itself and don't define the property set to pull out, it's going to give you an assumed property set. You know, name, SAM account name, distinguished name, things like that. But if I want to look at, say, the user's proxy addresses or the user's home directory, unless I've supplied that in the properties or pulled property star, it's not going to be something I can act upon. So that's where getMember comes in. So you can do some discovery on what sort of things you can do to the thing you're working with. And you know, some of my examples are a bit obtuse. So if anyone has questions about it, unmute yourself, talk and chat, and we'll have time at the end as well. Now, import CSV is going to be an important one, hopefully for you, because hopefully you're getting data from another source and you're not having to hand type this stuff up. Hopefully your source is your SIS or your HR department. But we're going to do things, and this is something I started doing where I define a variable called the insert file path because I don't, you know, if I'm going to use it somewhere, I don't want to reuse it. Plus, I want it up at the top so that as I put it into different domains that we support, I can change if it's appropriate. But what I do is I define where is my insert file going to be located and what's the name of it. Then one thing I layer an extra layer on where I get all the content of that file. This is like doing text parsing of it. And all I'm doing is looking to see if the file's empty. There's no sense going through and processing an empty file. So let's check if it's empty. If it's not empty, so if the content is not null, then further down, we're going to say our students are equal to importing a CSV of that insert file that we defined higher up in the script. So now my variable of students contains whoever the heck was in that file. And similarly, we can do something with export CSV. So let's say at the end of the day and your script did create some new users, maybe you want to log that in a CSV somewhere of the new users you created on that day. So that way, if you ever had to, you could go back and reference your logs to say, listen, this user was created on this day, something happened here, and you know, whatever narrative you need to tell, it would be in your log files. So a way of handling that would be to the way I handle it within the script for the students is I create an empty array outside of my for each. So before I go acting on the students in my loop, I create an empty array. And then once I enter into the loop, if I've determined I'm going to create that user, I now take that student and throw them into the array. The way you handle that is you do $array plus equals the object you're throwing into it. So as it loops through, it analyzes, you know, do I need to create this user? Yes or no? If yes, then I'm going to throw it into this array. And then at the end of my script, I take that array, whoever existed in it, and I pipe that to export CSV, and I create a CSV with new users that were created on this date. And no type information removes like 3 rows that are just junk data you don't need. If you do no type information, then you won't have to manually edit your CSV afterwards if you want to act upon it. And I'm also doing a switch parameter here of -append, so that as the day goes on and we run our student import script every hour, if it's creating new users every hour, it's just going to append the new user to that file so that we can still reference them. when we start talking about loops and things like that, it's more of like flow control is the terminology they use in PowerShell. So when we're talking about flow control, it's important to understand that there are operators we're going to use: equal to, not equal to, greater than, in, not in, like, not like. And when we're using these operators, there is a order of precedence, just like with all math, right? There's an order of precedence that it comes in. This flow is your order of precedence. So if for some reason your script isn't working right and you got a lot of operators in there, you might have to consider reworking the order with which you make those operators act. When we're talking about operators, there's a bunch of operators to work with, but the key ones are going to be some comparison operators. We might be doing things like where username is equal to blah, or we might say things where is user contained in blah, uh, username like star ch star. There's a lot of different things you can do with these comparative operators. But the key piece here, sorry, I should go back to that. The key piece here is folks coming into PowerShell for the first time like to use things like the literal equal symbol or the greater than symbol or the uh, exclamation point for a not symbol. Uh, and it's important to understand that we have to do what PowerShell calls out, the dash EQ, the dash GT. That is their syntax. And it is case insensitive. So if you really, really want it to be case sensitive, you have to, as I'm calling out up here, you have to put a C at the beginning of your equal symbol to say case sensitive equal. Um, Other flow control would be logical operators. Um, with the logical operators that we're looking at, uh, it's basically taking multiple multiple conditions and combining them in ways. So this condition and this condition or this condition, or an XOR or a not. So we could say things like, I want to get all users where the grade is sixth grade and status equals enabled and something or something. So depending on what your logic breaks down to, just know that there's logical operators you can do here with your different expressions you're working with. All right, so when we're working with flow control, one thing you're going to do quite often is if statements, if, and else statements. The basic syntax there is if a thing is like a thing, then do stuff. And the way it breaks down when I use it in my scripts is, say, for example, middle name. Not all kids are going to have a middle name, and maybe we just stop filling out middle initial. But I found issues with my script that when it encountered a user with no middle initial, it would just kind of barf on me a little bit. So what I do now is if middle initial is null or empty, uh, if middle initial is not null or not empty, then I define the user's middle initial on their object. Else I just clear out the middle initial for any wonkiness that had gone wrong in the past. Because what had happened in the past when the script barfed on me is sometimes if you don't zero out your variables within your loop, then if you enter into a new loop and that variable doesn't get defined, it's going to use the variable from the last user from the previous loop. So I work with a coworker who, at the bottom of every loop, he basically zeroes out or nulls out all of his variables so he can be certain that by the next loop it's going to be empty. And that's a great way to handle it, but not one way that I was taking. So there came a point in time where we filled in the middle initial for students that wasn't their middle initial. So we cleared it up with this. But we also do it with the if. I put together an array for the groups that these users are going to be added to throughout the script. And so I look at if the group list is not null, then I'm going to, and this is something where I could have probably been a little bit more verbose. I could have called this group list identity, but basically what I did was I redefined the variable and I'm saying my group list is equal to the existing group list, but I'm going to pipe that to just selecting the users, just getting the identity of the object. Because when I do add AD group member, I need that identity. And here's that dollar underscore being used that we talked about earlier. So what I do is I say for every group this user should be a member of, I want to grab the identity, and then I'm going to take that identity and add the group member to it. More of this later when we talk about wrapping this all up. There's also potentially going to be switch statements you might want to use in your scripts. So a switch statement is a good way of getting away from a whole lot of if, else, else if statements. So for example, when I want to define variables that are unique to the building the user belongs to, I previously had a if building code equals blah, then define these variables. if building code equals blah, define these variables. And it just was a whole lot of if statements. A way of cleaning up those if statements is to to change to a switch. So when you use a switch, you just say switch and you look at what variable you're analyzing against. So for my case, it was the building code. So I look at the student's building code, and maybe you guys, some of this stuff might just be stuff you don't even care about, right? So maybe you don't care to fill out the office and the street address in the city because you are your city, right? But when I'm working with 7 different school districts, I kind of like having some identifiable information on the user's object so that when I have a problem with XYZ staff member or student, I don't have to go to Google and search, okay, what's the phone number for Dansville Elementary School again? Okay, what's the phone number for Waverly High School again? Okay, because I hated going looking for addresses and phone numbers, so I started putting it on the user objects itself. But so this doesn't have value to you, don't do it. But this had value because I can define all of the building codes that my data file feeds me, and I can define things like the building short name, which I use later to build my OU path for the users. I can define the street address so that I can go to that building more easily without having to look it up. And uh, sometimes we have unique passwords per building. We're working away from that. We're working to a better password system. But for the moment, I have within one school system, you know, middle school and high school have constructed passwords. High school might let the students change the passwords, but in the elementary, all of our passwords are set password. Not ideal. We're working away from it. Um, but I was able to define that more clearly within our switch statement. So if you're in this building and we know this building has a set password, instead of say using the defined password that came out of my script that we want to use in the future, instead this green line that I've got blurred out here, this line might call out a specific password for that grade level or that building level. So I can do things within that switch statement that way. I don't have a good example for the where object because I don't use where object too much in my script itself, but I use it in scripting when I'm working with things, and I wanted to at least cover the content. Is you're basically saying you're filtering down the result instead of whatever you're looking at. So if we were to do get AD user and pipe that to where objects last logon date is less than 90 days, we could filter down and see all users who have logged in within the last 90 days. So where object is all about filtering down based on whatever criteria you're dealing with at the time. For me anyway, not too useful in my IDM scripts, but very useful in day-to-day and in pulling reports and audits. And another one you'll see with flow control, the one you'll probably use most often is the for each loop. So basically like, here are all my students in the dollar students. And what I'm gonna do is for each student in students, I'm gonna do all these things. That's my loop coming in. But the important part to understand here is the difference between for each and for each. And I'm not being sarcastic. It's literally lowercase for each versus uppercase F and E. Uppercase F and E is an alias of for each object. The for each is different than for each object. For each is a language keyword. It's less memory efficient. It'll be faster if you have a lot of memory in your box. But a real key piece that you'd lose is you cannot pass the output from a for each loop into the input of another commandlet. For each does not allow for that. Whereas for each object is more memory efficient. You'll likely get slower results, but you can take that output and pass it into other commandlets should you need to. The syntax is slightly different, and what I'm offering here with the example is we're basically going to, if you go type this in your shell, you're going to iterate through what is this 100,000. You're iterate 100,000 times and see how long it takes you with a for each and a for each object loop, and your timing will vary. So depending on the size of your organization or potentially the specs that are on the machine that you're running the script on, that may impact which one you may want to use. And lastly, we're going to talk about the idea of task scheduler. So if you've never done any sort of automation of scripts or systems or stuff like that, it's important to kind of get comfortable with using task scheduler, because when you're done with these scripts, you're going to want to go throw them as a task that runs on whatever schedule is appropriate for you. Now, I've got an article here on how to create PowerShell scripts to run in a scheduled task. The one key piece I want to call out to you is don't use your username. When you go on vacation or your password expires, that automation is going to stop working. If you don't work for the org anymore, the automation is going to stop working. Please use a service account. And when you use that service account, don't be lazy like many of us have been and add that service account to domain admins. Take the time, take the effort, delegate out your AD as appropriate and give, maybe full control of user objects, maybe full control of domain workstations, but not servers, maybe full control of AD group uh, type stuff so that the script, the service account can access and add users to groups. But just don't give them domain admin across the board. But basically, when you're creating a task scheduler event for a PowerShell script to run, you're going to name what the task is. So I try to name it as what the project is, who it's impacting, and what the action is that it's doing. So I might have IDM student insert, IDM student update, IDM student group change, depending on if I broke the scripts up or had them all contained within one script, depending on the district we're working with. And then I've been trying to put a description in. Um, I know many of us are not very good at putting descriptions on the things we're putting in place, but trying to get better so that folks know what it is, what the purpose was, and there's no questions about it in the future. You'll notice I'm also running this as a service account. The service account had some delegation given to it. We are running this script whether or not a user is logged on, because this is going to be our automation box and we can't guarantee anyone will be logged into it. And we're going to run it with the highest privileges just in case anything's going to hit us here. Next thing you'd be looking at is your triggers tab. For myself, what we agreed upon in our org was that we would run this every hour. I need to get back to every 2 hours, but that creates multiple tasks since there is no repeat task every 2 hours option down here. But basically, we run it Monday through Friday, starting at 5:45 a.m. every hour until 5:45 p.m. because we run it every hour for 12 hours. And it's important to remember to check this enable button, because if you don't check the enable button, you might go ahead and create this task and then it never does a thing. I've done that, so yeah, that's fun. You go research and you're like, crap, it ran once and it wasn't enabled for automation. Um, Separate from that, you'd be going to the Actions tab and you'll be starting a program, you're starting PowerShell, and defining the path to where your script is. So for instance, this one is in a path, and this is the student insert script that's running. And that's it. Once, if you have your task scheduled and the script has been tested, you don't have to think about it anymore. Now, what I'll offer is, like, when I had that first script from back in the day, automating the help desk process, that was a script aimed at one school district to help one process, and it was something that I just ran manually as help desk needed it. And that was good. It still was a good step forward. It wasn't until we started talking about it as a process and supporting multiple districts that we started talking about task scheduler and having this run with automation. But what I just want people to do is, you've heard that phrase, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Um, Looking at this list for me is anxiety inducing. But what I was saying earlier in the morning session is being able to stop and look at this list after having put this presentation together, it does make me feel better, because what I'm looking at is I'm looking at where we came from to where we are now, and we're better. And there's going to be content in here I'm sharing with you that is stuff we are still working on. We are not done. We should not be held up as some golden child or anything. All I'm trying to do here is share what knowledge I understand with everyone else so that we can all get stronger for it. This is not to say that I'm doing things right or I'm doing things wrong. I'm just doing things. So when we're looking at automation, so we've covered all these PowerShell basics, right? We spent the last hour basically going over my PowerShell intro, my PowerShell intermediate content. We have a baseline understanding of what this should look like as far as how we can interact with things. Some of this is going to be you going and playing with it now, especially if you have no real history with PowerShell. Don Jones was quoted in one of the tech ed conferences as saying, if you're not going to use PowerShell, you're probably not going to be successful with it. And I believe that very strongly. Until you use this thing, you're not going to know how it benefits you. But automation end goal, right? We know how to use PowerShell, so we want to do things now. What I want to offer is do one thing, just like Andy was talking about in the cybersecurity thing. Be iterative about your process here. Pick one thing that's the biggest pain point for you and do that one thing. Get the dopamine hit from the success, and then do the next thing that you can get to. But our goal here is we want to create users, we want to provision our users and create them in AD. We want to control the access of our users through group membership. We want to control the consent that our users give through OAuth access. We want to entitle our users through licensing, which we can do based on the group membership we previously assigned. We want to federate our access, and I might be using federate wrong, whatever, if you're more into the terminology, but in my mind, the federate to me is like allowing my users to click sign in with Google or sign in with Microsoft and not having to create an account and remember the password for that account. Once it's all linked to our, whether it's OAuth or SAML or whatnot, that's where I'm equating the federate piece, just making our users' lives easier. We're also going to talk about personalizing and maintaining users as you move forward, right? So just because you created the user doesn't mean you're done with the user. You might have folks who have name changes or want to change their password, and how do you handle that? Or maybe you want to put some user photos on them as the years go by and you get new life touch photos. We also want to talk about deprovisioning our users, right? At some point, we want to get to disabling these users that are potential security risks for us. We might want to revoke access for users and yank their group memberships. We might want to delete the users outright and get them out of our environment. And then the last thing we want to do is say we did all this stuff and we're focused on Active Directory, right? Everything's been about PowerShell and AD. Now we talk about syncing our identities out to Google or Office 365 or Azure through the use of Azure AD Connect or Google Cloud Directory Sync. So again, this is an elephant, right? This is a lot of stuff to list out. And some of these topics, we could go a whole 1 hour session on just some of these topics. We've already done an hour on PowerShell basics. Now we're talking automation. So we want to provision users, right? So traditional sense, we used Active Directory users and computers, or maybe you were a really cool kid and you were using Active Directory Admin Center. Yes, Admin Center gives you some more visibility to the properties you can fill out rather than ADUC did. But regardless of which one you're using, it's manual. It will not scale. Those actions you did can never be redone. There's the potential for human error and typos. There's potentials especially with the whole process that we had for help desk before, you may forget some steps through the process. Maybe you forgot to add them to a group membership that they needed, and now they don't get licensed for a mailbox, and their teacher's been trying to send them mail, but meanwhile they couldn't get it because they didn't have a mailbox. People can forget things. The script will not. And you can also lose your processes over time. Let's say you had someone at your help desk who was in charge of user creation. Now that person goes and retires. What do? Hopefully they had the process documented. But if they didn't, at least with a script, it's all documented in the script. So let's pull together all the stuff we've talked about, and this is going to be reusing some of the imagery I've shared previously on some of the slides that we're working with, right? So we've talked about defining an insert file and checking to make sure that insert file is not empty. Then once we've verified it's not empty, we take our students and we import them from the file we have. Then we enter a for each loop. So we defined students as a variable. But one thing you'll notice and that trip people up when they do for each loops is we never defined $student. We are defining $student in the for each loop. Now, frankly, this for each loop on line 25, I could say for each $thing in students, and it would work as long as within that loop I'm referencing $thing. I could put $x in students, and as long as I'm referencing $x, it's going to work out. So you make up this variable, but what I tend to do for myself is I usually make my collection of people, my students, plural, and then I'll make it singular within the for each loop. So we do for each student and students, and notice that I occasionally on here I'm commenting things out to define all the variables. Again, some of these things you may not even need. Now, there was a period of time where I wasn't getting my usernames in my file. We were constructing our usernames within the IDM script itself. Now we're at a stage where my data team is providing me the username ahead of time, so I just use their username. But because there was a time where I was generating usernames, and some of you folks might want to generate your username in the script, is I would define things like the first name, which I pulled from the file. So $student dot IDM first name. So IDM underscore first name was the Excel or the CSV column header, right? So that's the column header, and then there are values below it. Now, first initial was not defined in my file, but I had a need for first initial because our usernames were first initial, last name. Or we had some schools where it was last name, first initial. So we defined first initial as the first name, the variable we had just defined, and we take a substring of the last of the first character. 0, comma 1 is the first character. And so learning substring is going to be something you'll have to dig into, but just know that if you do substring 0, 1, you grab the first character. I've got an if statement in my variable declaration here, same thing. I'm going to construct the full name. So I do $full name and $display name, which potentially, depending on the district, could potentially be different. Their display name, they might want something else in there with like their title. So full name and display name could be different. But we define it as the user's first name that we've already defined, plus a space, plus their last name. So now when I call $full name, I can just splat that in somewhere. I don't have to ever within my script do first name, space, last name. I like to declare all my variables up at the top of the script. And then there's other things where I might define the email address or let's say the title. Title wasn't included in my script either, so I'm just literally defining it right here within the script. This is another cool one too. If you look down here at the bottom, there was a point in time where we were using the last 4 digits of the student ID for part of their password construction. And so what we ended up doing was we would define the student ID, and notice I do a substring here as well. For some reason, for whatever reason, the files I'm getting from my data team, they contain the employee number. Depending if you're a staff or student, it's either UIC : numbers or it's PIC : numbers. So what I end up doing is stripping off the PIC and the UIC with this substring here. And then I take what content is remaining, their student number, and this is kind of cool where you can take a variable and you can do a -join. This is one of the operators. I can do a join operator on the previous variable and take the last 4 characters. And the way they do that is you take the -4, so you go all the way to the -4 to -1. The dot is another operator you can do. So let's say I want to do a loop 100 times. We saw that earlier with the measure command that I was doing, where I did 1 ... 100,000. That's a way of creating a loop. So instead of doing a for I = 0, I + 1, I blah blah blah, that whole loop where you get iterative loops every time, I can handle that a little differently. So further down in the script, after I define these variables for the user, now I start looking at their building code, right? We use that switch statement I talked about, so I can define information about the user's location to potentially help myself. Then I build some information about their, how I'm going to place them in AD. So I'll have a OU path append, and my variables tend to be a bit constructed. I broke them up in ways that made my brain feel good. You could make your variables longer. So like this OU path append isn't necessary if you were going to add it to whatever variable you use elsewhere. But because I was trying to make this flexible to work between different school districts, I wanted to be able to know that I had to only edit line 217 to change the OU path, something like that. So you can define an OU append, and then I take the OU path of, we have OU = student, comma, OU equals the building short name that we defined earlier from the switch, and then we append the domain type on there. And we also define the disabled path so they can use that later to send our disabled users over. We also do things like describing the user's description, where we construct that and we put, say, the building short name dash class of their year of grad. So when I'm in AD and I'm looking at Active Directory users' computers, my description fields are all filled out and give me the year of grad. And occasionally I can pop in there and notice, something happened and some of these users probably got deleted from the SIS. So because they got deleted, we never got through the process of decommissioning those users. So they might still be sitting there from year of grad, whatever. So having descriptions is helpful to me. And I also define the organization and the domain. Okay, so we've defined all these variables in the script, right? And it could be as many variables or as little variables as you need for your organization. Now you come in and do the thing I talked about with splatting, where we call out all those parameter names we're going to fill out and the values we want to use in those parameters that we had defined higher up in our script. And then we say new AD user splat. And line 275 is an interesting one I'll call your attention to, is if potentially you ever extended the schema in your AD, line 275 is how you're going to fill out the custom attributes on a user that from the schema extension. Because when you say set-AD user, there are a number of dash parameters you can fill out, right? You'll find that from GitHelp. But you'll find things like that extended schema isn't something that's in set AD user. So what you do instead is you do a set AD user where you do a dash add parameter and you add the custom schema extension property value property name, and then you supply it whatever value you need. So for this instance, we had a schema extension from the past that we were still using, and it was basically a bit that got flipped. You were either true or false. Do we create a Google account for you, true or false? And that was a schema extension that had been done. You may find that you don't have a need for this, but just be aware that dash add is how you get at those. And here's a cool thing, right? I lamented earlier about those students I wish had 8-digit characters because that is our domain policy for passwords. But if you guys aren't aware, not only can you have a domain policy for your passwords, you could apply fine-grained password policies or FGPP. You would assign fine-grained password policies through ADSI edit, linking this fine-grained password policy to some security group. So for instance, my special ed kids and my real lower L kids don't have to meet that 8-character password requirement. But when I go to create the user, AD by default, when you create a brand new user, is going to require you to meet your password requirement. So if you look up here on line 252, I define the user's account password as a temporary password. So when I create a user, I wish you had 8-digit characters. Now, as soon as that's done and I create the user object, I'm then adding the user to a group, right? So I add them to whatever groups were appropriate to their grade level or their building or their district. And then if that was one of the groups that was defined in fine-grained password policies, when I go to set AD account password afterwards, it will honor that less secure password. So it's important to create the user, assign their group membership, then you can set their password only if you're taking advantage of fine-grained password policies. If you don't do that, just set the password when you create the user. That's it. You can go automate now. Take that script you just made, run it a few times to feel comfortable, and then go throw it in Task Scheduler. Not with your account, with a delegated service account, but go throw that in, get your dopamine hit, stop creating user accounts, stop creating student accounts at least, and then start working on all these other things we're going to talk about. It's okay to stop here and feel good about creating users and no longer having to do that. All right, so we've created a user, right? And within the script, we would have done this thing to control their access. I'm just kind of pulling it out as a separate slide to talk about. What I do for groups to manage groups with my users is I define an array that is empty for their group list. And then as I'm going through, depending on the school district I'm working with, there might be some default groups that all students are a member of. For example, all students are a member of students. All students are a member of the content filter that we use. So what we do is we take that empty array and we do a plus equals whatever we're throwing into it. So I can use the display name or the friendly name of the group. Meanwhile, further down in my script, let's say I had that switch statement where I'm defining the building code this user belongs to. In the building code, I might have something like my St. Vincent students. So I might add those students to the St. V students group. Now that group, St. V students, is the one that might define my fine-grained password policy, which allows them to have an insecure password. I might also have a generic group where, not a generic, but a more targeted group in some districts where we literally called out this group membership is for password complexity disabling. So it's just a little bit more in your face of why this group and what this group does. So then once we've gone through the script and we've added we've populated our array of all the groups we want to add this user to, after we've created the user, we say, okay, if the user's group list array is not null, then we're gonna iterate through it and we're gonna grab the identity of every group and we're gonna take that group and add this user. That's it. It'll cycle through 1 or 100 groups and you don't have to care about it. And as long as your logic was built well, there should be no mistakes and no forgetting it too. So those students would get their distribution list for class of whatever. So when the counselor sends an email to class of whatever, that student did get the email. And the counselor doesn't have to resend the email once you've licensed the user and the user has a mailbox. It could become a whole thing, right? So consent, this is something we are actively working toward. So here's the deal, right? You have a user compromised. What's your, Andy's talking about what's your incident response plan. I'm hoping most people, when you believe your user's compromised, you go and change their password, right? But how many of you are also going in and killing all of their OAuth sessions that are out there? OAuth doesn't care about their password changes. So if this user has previously given consent to some nefarious OAuth service, that service will still have access to read their email if it had the rights to, or see directory listings if it had the right to. So there's a good Microsoft article here about protecting your remote workforce from consent phishing. We at Ingham had done we're working with some reviews of our existing consents that are out there and the permissions that go along with it. So there's a script where you can pull all delegations your users are given for user-side consent and the permission levels they give. So at least you have some visibility to it. Separate from that, you have the ability, if you want, within Azure to disable any future consents from your users. And it should be clear if you're working with your administration, this does not impact the existing consents your users have given. So if we're talking, what is the impact to the org? Nothing right now, except we're more secure. And now users have to engage with us if they want to give consent to some outside company to access our data. That should be a good thing, right? And then what we can do is we can go back and review the existing consents that are out there and start to analyze, is it appropriate? Do we need to have more discussions about it? Do we need to pull it from the user? And that's a whole separate project down that way. But you can also configure how the users consent to that and how the notifications happen. So now as users want to click sign in with Microsoft, a couple of us on our team are now getting consent notification messages from Microsoft saying this user on this date is requesting consent to this app, and you have this time frame to get back and talk with the user about that. So now we have an opportunity to look at terms of service, look at the privacy policy, talk with administration to see what value this brings, and then determine, do we really want to give these permissions to this app? And we'll give administrative consent for the org, and we will no longer allow the users to consent to it. Big project. Similar thing can be done in the Google side as well, where you take charge of your OAuth ecosystem. You can review and revoke some permissions. Working in Google Workspace is more difficult. They give you slightly less information. You have to do a little bit more hunting. You got to poke around a little bit more places, and there's not nice scripts to run to pull this all together. So this one's going to be a bit of a bear to work through a little bit. One thing to mention here is when you get into analyzing third-party and internal apps that have access to your workspace data, um, look at your domain-wide delegations as well. Many of you will probably see that you have GAM, whatever GAM projects you've created in the past, you'll have domain-wide delegation to GAM. But you may find that some of your administrative users have given domain-wide delegation to some things you weren't aware of, and you'll want to have discussions about that if it's appropriate. Then we want to talk about group-based licensing. This is nice, especially if you have Azure ADP1, you should be able to take advantage of this. Most of you hopefully have access to Azure ADP1. Within Azure, you have the ability to assign licenses by group membership and the sub services within those SKUs to what your users will get. Previously, I used to manage some licensing in the Azure space with some PowerShell commandlets, but Jesus, it was a bear to manage licensing with PowerShell with the way they name their SKUs and turning off services within it and then passing it back through. It was a real bear. So if you can wrap your head around doing group-based licensing, you create an AD group, add your users to it. So like we have one called O365A1 faculty, O365A1 student, or M365A3 faculty, M365A3 student. So we can define those students and what level of licensing they're going to get based on their group membership. And that'll be unique to your org and how you license your users. Going back again though, A3 licensing with the changes that Microsoft has made, your Windows 10 license is attached to A3. So if your user uses a Windows device as their primary working device, regardless if they need Office install or not, you should be buying your users A3. In addition, there's other things. Yeah, script-based wasn't it, Bobby? Yeah, script-based Microsoft licensing was horrible. There may be times where you want to do things. So uh, this is getting into licensing talk. We don't have to go totally down this route, but let's say you want to do conditional access rules to ensure that your users have MFA turned on to access certain content on in your tenant space. The conditional access rule only applies to users who have A3 license attached to them. It won't function on the users without that A3 licensing. So sometimes you might find features within Microsoft space that they'll work, but you're not technically licensed for it. And you'll find other places where it just won't work at all because you're not licensed by the user. So just be aware of that and true yourself up with your org. Similarly, in the Google side, there is the ability within Google to license your users by OU. but you may find, like us, you don't necessarily move your users around the org units as much. So they may sit stale in some org units for a while. And so until we can get our heads wrapped around that piece of it, we can't do automatic licensing based on org unit because I'll eat up all my licensing before I even license active users. So what we're working towards right now is, for the moment, I use GAM. So whenever I need to, I get an export of all the teachers and I throw GAM at it to license them for the G Suite teacher premium, whatever that stupid licensing is Microsoft gave us so that we can have breakout rooms, which is all the crave. Everyone wants breakout rooms. Whatever. What you can do now, though, is GCDS, or Google Cloud Directory Sync, does allow you to manage your licensing within the toolset itself now as well. So you don't have to use GAM, but I don't manage GCDS, so I'll be working with my peer that manages that system to try and get that implemented across the domains we work with. And then I talked about federating. So this is just a general idea of trying to understand how to set up SSO or SAML apps within your Azure AD tenant. So for example, this KissFlow app that we use for approval processes within Ingham ISD, I have never logged into KissFlow before. I've never used KissFlow. I have no need for it. But at the same time, I can go to KissFlow and click sign in with Office 365 and boom, I'm in. I have access to some stuff. That's really cool. It's a good thing for our users. So now my user doesn't have to create an account and have a separate password and all that sort of thing. Um, so you have that available to you. And within the Google space, you have similar. If you set up SAML apps, things like the My Data Hub. Again, I've never gone to My Data Hub. I have no real need for it in my job role that I'm aware of. So, but at the same time, if I hit My Data Hub, pick my org, I'm in. It knows who I am. It's managed by the SAML access we provided it. Personalizing. Okay, so we've created the accounts, right? We still own those accounts. We still have to help these users. So there's some things that you need to at least think about. Even if you can't automate these things, they're things that you should at least be aware. What do you do when a user wants to change their first name, right? And then how does that impact other systems? So if you're constructing your username and your email address and such from the user's first name information, that's going to be impactful, right? But maybe not. So Christopher to Chris, I'm still going to be C. Thomas. But William to Bill, he's W. Patterson or he's B. Patterson, or he's both with aliases. So that's something you need to think about in your org and how you're going to support users. Or a Barbara to Barb, we keep the first initial, but a Margaret to Peggy, we get new initials. And then think about if your secretary or your registrar just made mistakes. I've had folks put students in, and for some reason, the student's last name is the teacher's name because the secretary just had a brain fart when they were entering that student into the SIS, and they put it in wrong. And you might find too, as we continue to go down this road, there's more students who are uh, changing their name based on gender identity, right? So we've have some students with dysphoria and things like that. So the ability to change their name so they see the name that they identify with and no longer see their dead name, it could be helpful to these students' mental health. So you have to rationalize how you're going to support changing first names for your users. You have to also think about how you're going to handle last name changes, right? We might have marriages, we might have divorces, kids get adopted, and again, secretary or registrar might make mistakes. How do you handle that? What other things does it impact? Also consider, where do you get your changes from? So within Ingham, for example, my name in the HR system is Christopher, but I have a preferred name of Chris. So within our system, because we have a data team that can take things from various disparate sources and give me one file that I need to work on, we can take advantage of this other system we have within employee self-service. Within the employee self-service webpage, I can go in and define my preferred name. Now my data team ingests that preferred name and sticks it in the file for my staff and students. Not students, because we don't do it with students right now. But this allows me to take advantage of the preferred name. But if I didn't have that employee self-service and I didn't have a data team that could take that disparate system and put it into my insert file or my update file, I might be in a position where I have to say, listen, I understand you want to be called Chris and not Christopher, but you have to go change it in HR. And then HR might have their own processes by which you have to show that it was legally changed or whatnot. So it may be a struggle to support changing first names, especially depending on where you pick your authoritative source to come from. Is your authoritative source going to be just a request that came in through your ticket system saying XYZ student wants to change their name to Chris? Or do you insist, okay, if that student wants to be called Chris, please change that in the SIS and it will be changed through automation on the next update cycle. Just some things for you to think through. And then when you do change those names, if you do accept that, what else are you going to change on that user object? You're going to change their display name, their given name, you're going to change their home directory path. Does their email address change? Do you add proxy addresses so they can still receive email to the old address? Let's say you have a high school student who just changed their gender. That high school student may have been in communication with some colleges, and then you change their email address. Now, if you didn't put a proxy address on the student, they've lost all communication with that college they had been in communication with because the email address changed. So it's something you got to think through and how you're going to support. And also, what impact does it have on other systems? I can't think of the system right now, but Brian often talks about one of our external, I feel like it's a Pearson program or something, but basically the test results and whatnot, or whatever these kids do in this system, it's attached to their user object. And this outside company we work with, they will not move that data to a new username. So at the very least, if I support changing the student's name in the SIS and in AD, Google, and Office 365, cool, the user can change their names. But because this outside system won't support migrating the data to this new account, I have to insist that when the student's using this external system, they use their old email address. And that's an awkward position to be in. So you should understand what your services can support. And as well as password self-service. So you got an AD environment, you have to decide whether or not you allow your users to change their password, right? This would be defined back on when you define new AD user and you're creating them, your parameter of cannot change password, did you make that true or false? Maybe you don't want any of your students to ever change their password, or maybe only if they're in high school they can change their password. There's all these things you could do, but you have to determine that for yourself and think about how you'll support it. And then let's say your users aren't on site and they can't change their password from Control-Alt-Delete, and you don't have always on VPN or a pre-log on gateway set up, so your users don't have access to the network off-site. How do you support them changing their password? Is all of it a call to help desk? Is your help desk ready to support all those calls for password changes and such? So that's where things could come in, where you could have a tool that we paid for like Portal Guard, where you could give a self-service portal for your users after they've claimed their account, where they can not only change their passwords, but unlock their accounts should they become unlocked or become locked. There may be some open source tools. I looked up a couple that seem to get top scores from community. There's one called PassScore and one called PWM. Those are solutions that you could put in your environment to allow your users to self-service reset their passwords. And depending on your license level within Azure, you may be able to turn on self-service password reset, which with Azure AD Connect, you could also have password write back so that it would go back to your AD environment and change your password there. But there's licensing things to think about there because it's not for your whole tenant. Technically, it's per user that should be licensed to take advantage of self-service password reset. And so those folks that you license with A1 wouldn't be eligible for this. So how do you support them? That sort of thing. And then if you roll out AD self-service password reset, just be aware that if you do not customize it ahead of time, it will start asking your users for their cell phone number when they go to log into Azure. And some of your users might get all uppity and talk to the union about it, and oh, that's not fair. So plan your rollout of AD self-service password reset. You also might want to set the user's photo. So we had a request at one point to take the life touch photos we have staff and put that on their account. When I got hired at Ingham, one of the sheets of paper we had in our welcome packet was like a "don't be a nobody" type thing, and the idea was asking the user as they hired on to take a work appropriate photo and upload it to these services and walk them through it. So what we were trying to accomplish was through the use of set user photo and the ability to get CDs or downloads from LifeTouch, we could potentially automate this and set user photos for all of our users. Good intentions, right? Good intentions are always the thing. What we found is I can't really automate this well. We're finding that the XML file that I get, because they don't give me a CSV from LifeTouch, but the XML file I get from LifeTouch might define the user's first name as nothing. All I got was a last name, and I'm not gonna just guess at which Thomas user is gonna get the photo of my face, right? There's multiple Thomases in our organization and no first name, or they might have missed the LifeTouch person at the time of the photo taking may have misspelled the person's first name or put in Peggy when the person's legal name and username is Margaret. So I'm sitting here trying to figure out who the hell Peggy is. Meanwhile, her username is Margaret. So it's like it's hard to use this Excel file, this XML file, to automatically set user photos when the data itself isn't even put together well. So be aware that it's here and that it's a thing. And hopefully your data is cleaner, but I couldn't automate this anyway. I can do it on a per run basis, but I got to run multiple cycles to identify which users don't link up. So now we get around to deprovisioning users. So um, when we talk about deprovisioning users, we want to potentially regularly check our AD to see users who haven't logged in recently. Depending on your org, that can be complicated, right? So I've got some users who will never log into their AD accounts, potentially ever within my environment, because we don't have always on or pre-log on VPN connections. And these users might work for Ingham ISD and have an Ingham ISD laptop, but they get put out in a local that we don't have a tech contract with because they are instead a special ed contract, or we're giving a DHH person to a local. So those users will almost never touch my environment, but every 6 months when they come have a staff meeting back at the office. So just be aware that that the link I have up here with understanding the AD account attributes with last logon timestamp, and last logon date, there are some caveats there. There's about, I think it's a 14-day time span where you really can't trust the information within about a 14-day time window. So really you should go over 14 days for anything that you are going to build your scripts on. And there's two different ways you can handle disabling your users. So if we look on the right-hand side, this is traditionally how I handle my disable script. It's very similar to other things where, you know, I define my students, and that could be from importing a CSV, or I could define my students based on a get AD user, where last logon date, blah, blah, blah. Regardless, get a set of users, and then for each student in students, we're going to get information about the student. And the reason I get information about the student, I get AD user, is I want to see when the last time they logged in was. Because while I might not filter on it necessarily, I use this in my construction of a new description. So what I do down here is once I've defined their last logon date, I break down their distinguished names so I can figure out what organizational unit they came from, so that should I need to, I can put them back in the org unit they came from. So I end up set AD user to enabled status false. So that disables the user account. And then I do set AD user and change their description. Now the form of this description tells me the last logon date, LL colon, last logon date, their originating OU and what OU they came from, and the date at which this took action and the admin who had run it. So in this case, the admin who had run it was my IDM project, but the logic of what I'm doing here was taken from my use of AD tidy. So I use a tool called AD tidy from CJW Dev. I think he still sells the product. It's really nice. Basically, it's just a bunch of PowerShell and a GUI for you. But I have some variables that I can define so that myself or others, if we run through and we disable users outside the script and we use the tool instead, it would define myself or my peers that had run the script as the admin who had done the disabling. And then I go and I move the AD object, move that user to the disabled OU. So this is a script that you could just take from me and try and play in your own environment. Thank you, Eric. You could play in your own environment here. Separate from that, if you wanted to go real basic and like more modern, like the newer commandlets, if you had the users you want to disable, you could simply get the user, pipe that user to disable AD account, and then pipe that user to move their object. That's as simple as your disable script could be. And it could probably even be more simple if you want to remove some of the variable sets I'm doing here, but disabling your users doesn't have to be terribly difficult. And if you wanted to, you could go buy AD Tidy and have a graphical interface to make yourself feel more comfortable. Plus, with AD Tidy, one nice thing they have, I'm not totally trying to sell the product, but they do allow for backup restores. So every action you do would get logged in a file so that you could potentially undo it by doing the reverse actions against that file. So that's kind of cool. So let's say we disable the user, we remove their group memberships, right? So now we want to strip their access. or potentially we want to strip their access without disabling them. Let's say we have a user who is on disciplinary leave or whatnot. We might have to strip all their group memberships real quick so they no longer get emails on a distribution list. Now, one way we could do that is um, we found the user, right? So when we're in the loop of looking at a user, we can define the user's groups here on line 8. $groups is equal to the user, whatever they were a member of. So dot member of is taking their group list. And then what we do is we iterate through each group in the groups, and we remove the 80 group member from the group and the user we're working with. And this is an interesting one as far as parameters go. So we've talked about named parameters, positional parameters, and switch parameters. This is kind of a named switch parameter in a way. It's like a mix of the two because we have to define dash confirm, but we don't put a space in the value. We've got to put a colon value. It's usually only with confirm. There are a couple other parameters you'll find that need that colon put in, and it's a bear to figure out unless you sit down and read the get help. If you read the get help on the command that you're working with, it will tell you how to use these parameters. And also worth noting, this simply removes the users from all the groups. You might want to consider auditing and potentially building more code in here that says, okay, I want to find the users groups. Now I'm going to export that to a CSV. Then I'm going to remove the user from all the groups. I just don't know, your use case and whether or not you might potentially have to put those groups back on. Because what I found in our organization is there are a fair number of groups that I can define programmatically that the user should be a member of, but there are also some cross-teaming groups and whatnot that just kind of naturally evolved over the years, or someone filling in for someone, and there ain't no way I'm putting all those groups back if I, really quickly stripped it. I'm not going to be aware of it. And unless we had audit logs on our AD, which I don't even know if we do, I won't be aware of those changes of the group they got stripped from. So just consider that, consider auditing and exporting it if you need to. The last bit I would talk about with regards to deprovisioning your users is removing the actual AD account, right? So removing the AD user. I would strongly consider running it manually until you and your organization are comfortable that what you've defined as how you're going to delete those users is accurate. You'll want to think about things like don't include your service account OU. You don't want to be going and removing your service accounts, right, on accident. Make sure that the criteria by which you pass stuff to remove AD user is appropriate, or just make sure that you're running this manually and double checking things. And I'll also mention too that if you weren't aware that Active Directory has a recycling bin when you get to the appropriate functional level, it does, and you have to enable it. So if you haven't enabled AD recycling bin in your environment, you should consider enabling recycling bin in your environment. And if you're on a functional level that doesn't even support the recycling bin, consider upgrading your functional level so that you can get support for that. And then we talk about syncing. Azure AD Connect is going to be your go-to if you're not using ADFS. If you're using ADFS, you're over my head. I don't know. I don't even know that topic. One of our schools does use ADFS, but we've got other folks who tend to know a little bit more about that. But as far as Azure AD Connect, this is a tool hopefully most of us have set up at this point, but it syncs your AD up to the cloud, and there's various pieces and parts you can configure within that. Within the Google space, we have Google Cloud Directory Sync, or GCDS, that can be used to sync your users to the cloud. There's also G Suite Password Sync, GSPS, so that can watch all your password changes on the domain and sync that up to Google as well. It's worth noting that when you create an AD user and you have your GCDS cycle take that new user and sync it up to the cloud, you've created the user with your script and you set a password for the user on the script, but the user did not exist in Google. Now, when GCDS syncs that user up to the cloud, you need to come in after the fact and set the user's password so that GSPS will sync it to the cloud and the user can use that password. It's very important that you figure out your timing on your task scheduler events so that you have your insert your user task, you have your GCDS task, and then you have a password set task so that those things operate in order so that your users have the best experience. That's it. That's everything I got. We'll see what Eric has. We're 6 minutes early. Well, we're not. We're at 11:45. So we got time for questions. If people have questions, we got time for Eric to chime in on how he handles things separately in his environment. But this is the fast and dirty how to use PowerShell in an IDM.
Yeah, and it's really like it, you're taking a topic that we could probably spend a full day on and doing it in 2 hours. Um,
How'd it go?
so
Did it sound
it,
decent?
it was, yeah, yeah, went over a lot of the basics. So I'm gonna go ahead. Do you mind if I share my screen for a minute
Yeah,
there?
yeah.
All right,
Do I have to stop this, or are you just gonna take over?
beats
Stop
me.
sharing. Well, stop sharing there.
All right, so let's just take a
Look at
look at.
Eric over there in VS Code.
Ha. So, somebody asked a question about switching and doing switching instead of if statements. So there's a time and a place for both, right? So this one in particular, I did if statements to do my grad year. The problem with grad year, of course, is that at a certain time of the year, their grad year will be different if you just do a regular mathematical calculation. So you have to set their grade to either be, 0 or -1, depending on what time of the year it is. Um, so that goes back to this calculation here. Like Chris said, he's talking about at the beginning of he does all of the sets all of the variables for the whole thing. So right here, I'm setting their grad year because that's not stored in my sys. All I have in there is a grade. Um, and that's because the sys doesn't want to extrapolate a grad year, from what I understand, doesn't want to extrapolate a grad year because that can change. So they just do it by grade level. So I just get a grade level. I need a grad year because that's what I put them in OUs. So I do all the math there to figure that all out.
Can you explain your line 30 a little bit?
930. Yep. So that's the one. If the current month is less than 7, so if it's before July, then it's a 0. Otherwise, it's a 1. So that does. So when you do the math, you do your current year plus the year change.
Dependent on
So
which month you're currently in.
exactly. So that's how you get the grade string. So that's why you get your grad year, or sorry, up here. That's where you get your grad year right there. So it's
So
really,
my data team is doing something similar on their side. They also analyze the grade level and give me a year of grad. So it's worth noting that, you know, all this heavy lifting was put on our data team to provide this year of grad to us. And until we were aware of this whole snafu that could happen, I was for a period of time getting provided the wrong grad year for some users. So they also implemented logic very similar to this.
yeah. And it really depends on, so if the student gets added, let's just say from July to December, their grad year actually calculates correctly. But if they get added to your school as of January, their grad year is going to be off by a year unless you do this calculation and make it, manipulate that date. Um, so, you know, purpose for an if statement, but here's a switch that I did right here. And this is one that I was messing with. So your switch doesn't have to necessarily be a one-to-one. This is actually an old script. I had to go back and find this because we don't actually use this anymore. Um, but you can do multiple um, variables. So you can say either pre or EC or pre 3 year or O1 or O2, then you're going to make it the Rocket Mac students. So that's my lower elementary students. Um, so instead of, the old way of doing a switch was just one line per. So you would have pre contains or pre equals Rocket Mech students and O3 equals Rocket Mech students. And that was how you would do a switch. But with this, with the commas and the single quotes, you can actually do multiple different options in there and then put them all towards one end result. Um, let's see. What else am I doing that's a little bit different than Chris? There's my splat.
Eric's got a bit more error handling. He at least does some try statements where I don't do try catches too often.
Yeah, so I try to make this, I try to make this as idiot proof as possible. So this script has with very few, like I removed this when we got a new content filter. It's the same content filter, it's just now we're in the cloud versus and I don't need to worry about it anymore. But with very few edits, this thing has been running since probably 18, probably 17 or 16 with very, very few edits over the years. Um, very few errors through the years, but it just works. So that's why I try to do all the different error handling and everything right in there. Let's see, what else do I do? This is where I disable inactive students or enable active students. Um, and then, yeah, there's one of my catches to deal with issues. Let's see. All right, and then I wanted to show one more thing. I think that's all for this one. Um, if you wanted to get really fancy, something Chris needs to still do is
I
set up a
know.
universal variables file. Another reason that I rarely ever touch it is I pull all of my variables, a lot of my variables out of a universal variables folder, XML file that I use. So it looks a lot like this. Let me see if I can make that bigger. So it just, what I do is I set all of my environmental variables in here. So if I ever change the folder for GAM, I don't have to go back through all of my GAM scripts and change the location of GAM. I just come in here to this one file and I change the location or the file name or whatever, and then it updates all of my scripts. So the script just pulls all the variables from here. So all the different little things that I do, like the student OU. If I were to ever change that for any reason, some application required it, whatever, I could come in here and change that OU right there and it would update all of my scripts all the way out through. Same with the Gmail. You know, if we ever switched over to 365 or whatever, I come in here and switch it. Now I'm sending email through there. Um, so that's just what I do with the universal variables. But this was one Chris was talking about, pulling information and doing stuff based um, on things that you pull from a file. So in this example, he was pulling it from a CSV. I'm actually pulling it right out of Active Directory. So this is one of my GAM scripts, and I pull all of my information right out of AD. I don't use a CSV files except for the one that comes from the sys, which sets on the hard drive of the machine for approximately 30 seconds before it gets flipped, imported, and deleted. So this one here, I go out, I get AD user, and I filter it based on the different, what do you call these? The properties. So on the properties of the user, so I'm going to search base, and then what I do right here, this is the key right here. So Chris was talking about um, disabling users who hadn't logged in for a long time. You can do that same thing with this kind of a command here. I'm doing it based on when the user was created. So I'm running this GAM script against the user that was created today. Um, so if the user, when created, is greater than the date -1, so that's today, then I'm going to do this with them. Otherwise, I'm going to ignore them. So you could do the same thing with last logon. Last logon is one of the properties in Active Directory. You could do a if user um, when logon is greater than what, like 90 days or something, then you could go ahead and disable that account. And you would use a command that looks similar to this guy way down here. So we're just gonna enable or disable AD student.
Now, Mona had asked a question about once you've typed your script up, you're running it in a sandbox or doing, how you're testing it. So at least I'll speak for myself. We don't have a sandbox to run it in, so no, I don't do that. But the way I write my scripts is when I'm writing my scripts out, I use write host a lot, write dash host, so it'll spit something out on the screen. And so if I've got a script where I'm going to do something like set AD user, I will comment out the set AD user, and right above that, I will put write host and fill out something like my intent is to disable dollar username. They last logged on dollar last logon. So I'll print something on the screen and I'll run it through, and then I'll do a visual check, like gut check. Does this look right? If it looks right, I tend to do something else. So you can do something like when you're importing your CSV. So like let's say I say students equals import CSV, and it's a file, right? And we import 100 students into this dollar students. Now I could do something like dollar students equals dollar students pipe to select first five. So I select first one. So my method of testing out my scripts is first I write to the screen about what it should be doing. Now, meanwhile, I know I see it. Okay, there we go. There's the what if. Folks are going to say what if, and I recognize that, but there are going to be some people, especially newer to PowerShell, who aren't going to be able to understand really reading the what if statement necessarily. So having a write host and being able to like change the coloring of it and stuff, the foreground color, background color, at least for my mindset, helps me because I can just spit it in the screen and see what would have happened. But yes, be aware of what if as a parameter using it. Um, so what I'll tend to do is I'll spit it out on the screen to see what it would have done inside that loop and make sure that it's maintaining scope of the variables. And then once I verified that, I will usually take whatever set of users I'm working with and pipe that to select the first one, and I'll spit that out so I see which user I'm working with. And then I'll uncomment the line that was going to be impactful, and I'll have it run on that one user. So if something goes wrong, I only have to fix that one user and put it back to the way it was before anyone notices. And then if that one user went well, I'll pipe it to select first five and throw it against five. And frankly, if it works against one and it works against five, I'll throw it at 1,000. I don't care. So that's my method. I'm not sure what Eric's is.
I do, so it really depends on what I'm trying to do. If I'm just doing something small, like if I'm making a GAM script, I'll do exactly that. Like that's the quickest, easiest way to do it is that write output that you use. Um, you can have it throw absolutely everything you were going to do. You could also write it out to a text file. So if it's going to be a whole ton of stuff that you want to really check, you could do a write output, and you could throw that into a different place, or you could do some of the log filing that I do, the add content here. This is a really good way to check stuff. So what I'll do is if this is a script right here that I created that just moves disabled users. So throughout the year, all these students come and go, and as they get removed from the sys, they get disabled in AD by my scripts. And so at the end of the year, I've got a folder with, I don't know, I've got my student folder with probably 50, 60 disabled students that have left throughout the year. So what I'll do at the end of the year is I'll run this script just to move them into an exited OU so that I can just take a peek at them, look at them, decide if I want to delete them or not. Um, but that's what this one does. So what I could do with this particular script, like Chris was saying, is this is the one right here, the move AD object. That's the one that actually does the work. So if I were to go through and just comment this one out right here, that's going to make so that actually doesn't do any work, but the add content will still do there. So what this add content line does is it's going to add the content to the log file. So add content path log file, and that's described up here. And this is the value, this is what I'm going to put in there. So on this date, the user moved, and it's got the student's name. So I can run this right now, then I can go back to the log file. I can take a look at it and say, okay, this is what it would have done, is it would have moved all these students. I can double check that, make sure that's correct, and then boom, I've got all my information. Yep, it looks like it moved all the correct students. Now I can go through, delete that comment line, and off we go. So I do have the ability to spin up AD, do an export and import. I've done that a couple of times. Like when I created all this stuff when I first started there, I spun up an AD server, um, just created a read-only version of the my current domain, exactly how it's set. You can import that into a different host and then just test against it, and you won't hurt anything on the live side. So it's fairly easy to do. But I think realistically, it's not all that necessary because you can do all of the different logging pieces, the add content, the write output, to be able to either show you what's
What
on the
if?
screen or, yeah, you could do what if. I don't know. What if what if won't always give you the correct output, especially if you're inside of for each. It doesn't always give the correct output.
Mhm. Well, Eric, we got about 5 minutes left in the planned session time we have.
Yeah.
Do any participants want to either unmute themselves to ask a question or type something in chat? Is there anything through this process that we didn't make clear and kind of how we're handling it? And again, going back to remember that this is an iterative process. This is something that we built over years of working on things, right? Focus on the big thing to yourself. If it's just passwords that are getting to Google, go implement GSPS and get your password syncing out to Google so your users have a better experience. If it's creating users because that is a monkey on your back that you don't want, or a monkey for your peers that you don't want on them, then consider a new AD user script to take that off you. It doesn't have to be everything, but just hopefully now you see at least the idea of at least how I envision a whole IDM project and managing your users' access and identity to things. But are there any questions out there?
There was one question about self-service packet password reset right back to force GSPS to update Google. Yes, it does.
It
So
does.
if you're
Okay.
using, yeah, if you're using one of the password reset tools that are into AD, it'll tick that box that actually tells GSPS that there's been an update and it needs to send out the new password.
That's good to know.
But we use the ADFS, the built-in ADFS one on the Windows server to do our password resets. Works great.
Chat seems quiet. No one's unmuting themselves. It's
This is
looking
the
like we
point
may
where Yeah, this is a point where I would throw around a foam ball at people and make them talk.
make them ask a question.
Yeah,
Wait, can we administratively unmute someone?
I think Lisa probably can.
Yeah, right. Well, if there are no questions, we got about 3 minutes left, and I'll probably just have Lisa end the recording as we get closer to this 11:45 if nothing's coming up here. Um, I'd like to take a moment and thank the board for putting together this version of Maids right now. Um, I enjoyed this. I enjoyed the prepping for all this. I was mentioning in the morning call again too that going back to that slide I had right with the eating the elephant and all the end goal of what your IDM project looks like. That was actually in like when I first drew the slide up before I had any content to go with it. It was anxiety inducing because it's like, holy crap, this is a lot of stuff you have to do to really manage a user's access, but it can be taken in stages, and being able to stop and look back at where you came from and where you're at can really help folks, at least for me, to right my mental health a little bit and right the ship and be like, okay, things aren't so bad. We've done good things here. We still have more things to do, absolutely. But looking to where we came from to where we're at, we've done good things, and hopefully this will allow you guys to do good things in your district as well. We're getting some thank yous, so it looks like we'll probably wrap it up here and